I'm moving it down just a touch. I think we're about right, Kevin. I'll just move it down if I get too loud. Adjust it by putting it down there. All right. He's got to run off to teach his class. Before we get into class, I've asked Hunter to lead us in prayer. So let's all bow our heads.
Father in heaven, we come before you, thankful for this morning. We get to come to worship together. We ask that you be with us today. We ask that you open our hearts to your word. Be thankful for it. Help it to touch our lives that we may be better servants of yours. That as we go out into the community, we may live lives that spread you to others. We ask that you be with those who are sick and hurt. We ask that you comfort them and look over them. We also know that there are those who are grieving. We ask that you comfort them as well. We ask you please forgive us of our sins. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Please turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8. We're actually going to look at the last few verses of chapter 7 real quick. But we're going to be primarily in Matthew 8 and 9 today. Somebody's excited about Matthew 8 and 9. Sadie is. Yeah. Anyway, when you look at this text, we've been looking through the life of Christ. We've been looking at the things regarding his life and trying to draw some lessons from it. As I've said to you, we're not going to look at all the life of Christ, but we're just kind of drawing out the highlights, in particular, things that I guess you might say I think are most significant out of that. And that's all that is, just my thoughts on it. But we've looked so far at the birth of Christ. We've looked at his young life. We looked at the baptism and then the temptation of Christ. And we looked at the choosing of his disciples. And then last week we looked at what you would say the great teaching of Christ in the Sermon on the Mount. And what the Sermon on the Mount, the significance of it, the way that he taught. We didn't look at the text itself of the Sermon on the Mount. Certainly all of that is valid and some of the best things ever taught, but not quite in the scope of what we're looking at. I do want to look, like I said, just at the very end of Matthew 7 as we segue into chapter 8. And, Jesus tells a little parable at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 7, 24 through 27. And we'll go ahead and read this little parable, and it's one that I'm going to guess is recognizable to us all. But this is his closing to the statements he made in the Sermon on the Mount, and that is this. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it was founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Jesus tells this little parable. Two men, a wise man and a foolish man, each built a house. The wise man built his house on a rock, a foundation. We wouldn't necessarily build on a rock. We manufacture rocks, is what we essentially do. Most of the time we build a footer, which is a concrete rock. I mean, that's what it amounts to. We build a foundation, and we put concrete, and we make rocks. We do it because we can make it perfectly level. We can add blocks to it and other things, but we build on a rock, albeit a manufactured one. But he said two men, one built on a rock, on a good solid foundation, the other built on sand. And his point was, the one who hears and does what I say is like the one that built his house on a rock. The one who hears and doesn't is like the one that built his house on the sand. Merely hearing didn't make a difference. It is only the acceptance of, the belief in, and the change of action based upon what you heard. And so merely knowing, merely having the intellectual knowledge of God doesn't save anybody. Doesn't really help anybody if they don't put it into action. And so hearing, although is essential, it is not everything. And it depends on what we do based upon what we hear and what we know. And he says the wise will build on that foundation. The foolish, however, will not. A couple things to notice. The same rain, the same storms hit the two different houses. And, it was important that that happened.
In a spiritual sense, doesn't the rain and the wind represent trials that we go through?
I think certainly it does. I think in a spiritual sense it does. Difficulty hits. Difficulty hits in both instances. And struggles come. Like Jesus also says, the rain lands on the just and the unjust. And we all get the same sunshine. We all get the same rain. It's just, depends on what we build our lives on and how we have gone about that. And so I mentioned that because of how that plays very prominently into what Jesus says throughout all of his ministry and really all of his life. You can either decide, I'm going to follow after what he says and did or not. The thing is, we have consequences that go along with failing to obey, failing to follow him. He gives us the choice, and we can do what we want, but we don't. We're not exempt from the consequences that come from. If all you had to do is weather days like Friday, a $20 screen house would do for enough shelter. A tarp would be enough shelter for life if it was 75 degrees every day. You wouldn't need something. But we all know that days like that at any point in the year are still kind of rare because it gets too warm, it gets too cold, it gets rainy, it gets windy. There are other aspects that come about. But if every day was 75 degrees without wind, it would be, any old house will do. A cardboard box would be significant for a house on those kind of days. We realize that those days are few and far between in the best of climates. And you need something more substantial. Under perfect conditions, anything will work. Yeah, but for all the rest of the year, the other 330 days of the year that it isn't perfect, that there's wind or rain or too warm, too cold, whatever, for all the rest of the year, that you need something more substantial. You need something more significant. And because the wind and the waves are all they'll come. And, it's important to know that. It's important to know that you can be righteous and the wind and rain still hits. Difficulty still comes. And so, at the end of this, the people realized there's something very different about Jesus. He taught as one that had authority. As verse 28 and 29 say, he does not teach like the scribes. He doesn't teach like the others, but instead he teaches because he is speaking. And the thing is, he does have authority. He does have the authority to say what he does. And he's he's able to tell people how it is, not simply how they've read it to be. And that is very important. And he does this. The crowds are amazed at what he has to say. They're astonished at his teaching. And his teaching is significant to one and all. Any questions or comments before we go into chapter 8? Yes, Mark?
The one thing that I've always taken from this is it wasn't any rock, it was the rock. And our foundation is formed upon the rock. And another analogy of the sand is all other grouped in one group. All other theology, all other ideology. You know, there are snippets of truth in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in
Right.
other forms of religion. Even the lack of religion has some snippets of truth in it and wanting to do good for fellow man. But only the rock is the one that has any foundation at all that will
Right.
help you through whatever happens to you.
Yeah, certainly true. Anything that's not a rock is not building on a rock.
Right.
And that's very true.
And there's one truth, and that is God's truth.
Right, yeah. All others would be lumped in that. Randy?
One of the things about this parable is that the people, as he's telling this, the people don't understand.
No.
We have hindsight, and we know when he's talking about the builder of the rock, he's building on Christ and he's teaching. And like Mark says, if you're building on the sand, you're building on anything but Christ. So, I mean, we have, kind of hindsight into this where, he was giving a parable, and how many people really understood what he meant?
Right, yeah, most all the people didn't know. They just knew he spoke authoritatively. They didn't understand. Yeah, exactly. And Mark is right in the fact that there is some truth in most every religion. There is some truth, there's some meaning. Usually it's because they stole from the Bible, so to be just quite blunt about it. They stole concepts from the Bible itself. I've seen many times, you find an article on how to have a great marriage, or how to deal with difficult people, or different things like that on MSN or whatever. They are talking to worldly psychologists, okay? These are worldly psychologists and sociologists. And you read down through the list, and you think, wow, that's good stuff. That's straight out of the Bible. They may not know it, but it is. And when you look at it and like, okay, you just see right there and think, you can immediately, put biblical text that tells this. And, they may have got it out of textbook. They may have heard it because it's tried and true based on research or whatever, but it's straight out of the Bible as far as the truth of it goes. And the problem is people don't want to acknowledge that or believe that or understand that because it's very true. And so sometimes some of the pop psychology is actually good stuff, but it's because it's accidentally good stuff because they don't know they're quoting the Bible, and they're out of their ignorance. But like they say, even the blind squirrel find a nut every now and then. Certainly they do that. Yes.
Eventually, the rock won't just simply be the Word of God, but the church on which the Word comes.
Yeah, and something that comes along later in Matthew that we'll look at, I'm sure, in our course of our study. In Matthew 16, that Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my church. And of course, the rock there is the confession made that Peter made that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so his church is going to be built upon that foundation. The significance of what it means that Jesus is the Son of God. And his church is going to be built upon that foundation. And by extension, we need to build our individual lives upon that in ourselves. So we need to build on that good foundation. And, it's like this. If you don't start out with a good foundation, everything else is out of line, obsolete, doesn't work. one of the things that I think is real important, and you go over to 1 Peter chapter 2, and 1 Peter talks about Christ being the stone the builders rejected, that great prophecy. It's one of the most quoted prophecies. Jesus talks about it with himself, and Peter brings that to mind, that Jesus is the stone the builders rejected, meaning those scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees, that he's the one that they rejected because when they saw him, they did not include him. The problem is this, because, their blueprint, so to speak, of religion and worldview, they looked at what their view of the Messiah was going to be, and they had this stone, and they looked at that stone, and based on what they believed the Messiah was going to be, what their set of the plans looked like, and they were like, he doesn't fit. And the truth is this: you can never, ever fit Jesus into your life. It doesn't work. You can't fit the cornerstone into your life. You must scrap whatever you've got, start with the cornerstone, and then build your life. You see, their problem was they were trying to fit the cornerstone in late in the process. You don't fit the cornerstone into your life. And so many people, the reason why they fail at Christianity is because they try to fit Jesus in their life. You can't do that. You've got to start over and fit your life into Christ. You start with the cornerstone, and then you build everything else. He's got to be the beginning of it all, and not just something you slide in there and fit in. If you're going at it from that direction, you're going at it all backwards. You don't build the foundation last. You build the foundation first. And then from there, everything else. And so it is exactly that way. Jesus has got to be the cornerstone, the foundation that you start with, and then put everything else in. Anything? Okay. All right. Matthew 8. Matthew 8 and 9 are what I want us to cover today. We're not going to get to cover all of Matthew 8 and 9, but what basically you find in Matthew 8 and 9, there are some other things here, but for the most part, these are some of the accounts of the miracles that Jesus performed. And very quickly, you got Jesus heals the leper that we're going to look at here in just a moment. You look at the centurion, Jesus heals his servant. You see in verses 14 through 17, just a blanket statement that Jesus heals many. You see one of the most powerful miracles that he presents in verses 23 through 27, where he calms the storm. You see him overcome the power of the demons by healing a couple men that have demons. At the end of chapter 8, you see Jesus healing a man that is paralyzed in Matthew 9. You see stuck in there the calling of Matthew, which we looked at already last week, or a couple weeks ago. You see him talk about fasting, but then he goes right back into miracles. He heals the Jairus' daughter who is dead, restores her to life, and the woman that had the bleeding disorder. He heals a couple blind men. He heals a mute man. And so what you'll notice here in all these miracles between these two chapters is he does things miraculously that have power over healing. He has power over nature by being able to calm a storm. He does not only one kind of healing, You know, he's healing over the paralyzed. He's healing over the blind. He's healing over the mute. He's healing over the demon-possessed. He can do it all. And that dovetails in with his teaching. He teaches authority with authority because he has authority. And he has the power to go along with that authority. And that's what this section is. And so if we don't cover every part of this, just know that's what this is all about. And so I gave you the overview at the end. At the beginning. So, but to me, this healing here is one of the most powerful of all he does. This first one, when he heals this leper. Look at this, it says. When he came down from the mountain, meaning the mountain where he had the sermon, great crowds followed him. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. Now I want to stop right there. What's going on? What's Jesus doing? What's he doing? Coming down from the mountain. What's going on around him?
All those people followed.
Great crowds are following him. He's coming down the mountain from what we would probably regard as the greatest sermon ever preached. Anybody want to argue on that point? I didn't think so. Outside of maybe the Pentecost sermon that Peter preached, probably the most significant sermon ever. Anyway, it's debatable on all those. But yeah, the Sermon on the Mount. He's coming down from the Sermon on the Mount. Crowds are following him. What happens? A leper comes to it. Now, what was the state of lepers in that day and time? They were shunned. They weren't allowed to mix with regular folk. You know, they had to be separate because it was a very misunderstood disease.
They even had to speak out to people.
They had to speak out and warn when they got close to people. They had to avoid people. Had they lived in their own colonies, you know, and so we see that. So here is an individual that is to be ostracized, that stays apart, because see, leprosy is infectious, but we've come to realize that if you just stay clean, that it's a cleanliness issue, that if you have clean drinking water and bathe regularly and take care of yourself, leprosy can be prevented in the vast majority of instances. There still is leprosy in places like India and Africa and some very poor third world countries that don't have clean drinking water, don't have clean sanitary practices. And so it does take place, but if you catch it early, it can be prevented and stopped. And so anyway, but it was very fearful because once you got it, there was no real cure for it in their day and time. It can be reversed or at least stopped today. You know, we know that there are things you can do, even an amputation to stop it if it's like on a particular limb. It can be. You can cure it. You can survive it. It's still very difficult to do. But for them, it was a very slow, nasty death sentence. People didn't recover from it. Probably the people that recovered from leprosy were the people that were misidentified as having leprosy. Probably people that would have things like we would think of today as something like a psoriasis or an eczema or something like that is a skin disease that you can recover from that was misidentified. Those are probably the only people that would have gotten away with having leprosy and getting better. So here's a man that is supposed to stay away from people. Supposed to be separate. And here's Jesus. Here, you know, if you were making a movie, you know how movie makers, they show one scene and they go over to another scene. You've got the one scene, you're just closing out the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus has these massive crowds around him. He speaks to them. He tells this parable, and he says, the one that hears and does builds their life upon the rock. The one that hears and doesn't builds their life on the sand. And the people are astonished. They're amazed. They're awestruck at what he taught and how he taught. And now they're walking down off the mountain following him. And so you've got that in one side of the movie screen. You do the split screen and you go over to this other side and you have a man, a leper. This unknown, unnamed leper. This unknown leper, for whatever reason, for whatever understanding, he wasn't allowed, undoubtedly, to be a part of the Sermon on the Mount group. They wouldn't let him among them. But in the transition, he has an opportunity to come up. And he comes up. He decides. We're not told what prompted him to do this. We're not told anything about him. We're not told about how long he has it, how advanced it is. But he has leprosy. And he comes to Jesus. He calls him Lord. He has come to a faith in one way or another. He's come to an understanding. Maybe he's heard about the other miracles that Jesus performed and other things he's doing.
It says here he worshipped him too.
Yes, the simply bowing down before him. And so here he is. On one side, this leper. This man that is to be ostracized. This man that is to be separate from other people. And he is going to do one of the most public of all things. You talk about a bold move by a leper. He is boldly coming to Jesus with crowds in tow. He's doing what you weren't supposed to do. Undoubtedly, there would have been some gasps. There had to have been. I probably would have gasped at that moment. You know, if you were right behind Jesus and realized the mass is going down the hill, and here comes a leper. It's like the Pepe Le Pew commercials. I mean, the cartoons. Remember the Pepe Le Pew cartoons where he could part the waters. The skunk goes through and everybody parts. I could just, in my mind, envision that's getting ready to play out if it doesn't turn out the way it does. Because no one wants to be near the leper. But the leper comes and he falls before Jesus. He bows down and he worships him. This is a bold and faith-driven move. And Jesus does what I would call one of the most amazing things he does in his entire ministry. What does he do? He touches him. And the thing about it is, I probably would have healed him and then touched him. But that's not what the text says. I'd have cleaned him up and then touched him. But the text, what does the text say? He comes in faith. He says, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. That's a powerful statement of faith. If you're willing, you can do it. You can do this. That's a powerful statement at any point. That's a really powerful statement that early in his ministry. If you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. Touched him, then healed him. The significance of the touch first and the heal after. Did Jesus need to touch him to heal him? No. What's the very next account in Matthew 8? Jesus healing the centurion's servant. He doesn't even go to the same zip code. Well, they didn't have zip codes, but he doesn't even go to the same town that the centurion's servant is in to heal him. Jesus doesn't have to go to him. Jesus doesn't have to touch him. Randy's exactly right. What's behind it? Well, it's compassion. lepers don't get touched, and for good reason. You know, if you've ever had an infectious disease and knew you were contagious, you could probably feel a little bit of what that's like if you had to be in a quarantine away from family and friends for a while. You know, if you've ever been around the isolation unit of the hospital, that's one of the saddest places there is. Because, you know, they really can't interact with people. And that's kind of where this leper was. But Jesus touched him. Did the most remarkable thing. He touched him, and then he healed him. Now, that kind of healing doesn't take place specifically today. But I do believe that the love and the compassion that Christ had for that man, God has for us and has for people today. And even though the healing may not come in that same way, the desire and the love behind it still is present. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go out and haphazardly lay our hands on lepers. You know, we need to use good wisdom in that. We need to be careful of that. You know, but yet we also need to recognize that the quote-unquote lepers in our world, the biggest thing that they are looking for are people to care about them. There are people that aren't lepers as in they have leprosy, but there are people in our society, in our world, that get treated like lepers. And showing kindness and compassion and care to them is very important. When you look at this leper, and Jesus encounters other lepers, when you look at the demon-possessed, when you look at the wicked, you know that Jesus doesn't encounter one single person that's too wicked that he won't deal with them. Now, there are people that come to him that are self-righteous, that are judgmental, that are wicked, and when he leaves them, they're still that way. But no one was too bad that Jesus wouldn't deal with them if they wanted. And so, for us, we can look at it and say no one is too bad that we shouldn't at least make the effort to help, to encourage, to give them the chance. There are some people that aren't going to change, and we get that. There are a lot of people in this world that are just going to be evil, and there's no getting around that. But we can at least make the overture. We can at least make it the opportunity to give them the chance. Now, if they don't accept that, well then they may have to deal with the consequences that come. And I think about people like that, you know, the people in the world that hate us, the radical Muslims and many others of the world. We should make an effort, but in the vast majority of chances, there's not going to be any peace there. They're not going to change, and there's not going to be any change there, and then we need to deal with that accordingly. But certainly there's no one so bad that they can't, if they're willing, that they can certainly change and repent of that.
The people weren't left to their own to make that decision, because he recognizes what the law had to say about it. Jesus did.
Yeah.
There was a law against it.
Yeah, Jesus would have been unclean touching a leper. He would have been ceremonially unclean. If it was anybody but him doing it and healing him, he would have been ceremonially unclean. Jesus would have been himself. Because he touched a leper, would have been in a quarantine for a while to see whether he was going to contract leprosy himself. Had it not been for the fact that he obviously heals the man and has power over it. You know, it was a situation that, had he not done what he done, had the power that he had, he put himself in jeopardy, ceremonially and socially as well. Big deal what he did.
I feel like the leper was just to the point where he decided that he was done with the leprosy. Whether he was going to be healed by Jesus or be killed by other people because of what he'd done, he just wanted to be finished with it. And he felt, I mean, this is totally my opinion, but I felt like that he realized that Jesus, in the position he was, that if he wasn't saved from this, that he was still worshiping Jesus and doing what he needed to do.
Right. He was going to go down worshiping Jesus. You know, and I think you bring up what is a very distinct possibility. I mean, what he was doing is so far out of the norm and so far wrong, it's certainly conceivable that he could have been killed for doing what he was doing. I mean, you just don't cross those lines. And, you know, on a hillside that probably had a few rocks on it, he
a couple, 10,000 people. I mean,
yeah.
Somebody in that group is going to be furious enough to do something about it.
And nobody's going to, yeah, and that's a very distinct possibility. And I think you're exactly right, Rob, when you say that he's pushing the issue. It's either Jesus is going to heal me or it's over. Either way, there's going to be some relief involved. And if he's going to go down fighting, he's going to go down praising Jesus doing it. Which is, if you're going to go down, that's the way to do it. Go down giving honor and praise to Jesus. When you look at this, and like I say, you look at this miracle, and I think you get a really good window into all of Jesus' miracles. And that is, what's his motivation? What's his focus? Why is he doing this? Well, he's doing this to be compassionate, to be kind. And he also recognizes that there's more to what he's doing than just simply healing. And you might say, Jesus here shows probably the greatest example of how bedside manner, so to speak, should be administered. That's in a lot of ways what he's doing. He is showing kindness and compassion that's not even necessary to healing. But yet, it's this personal touch, this literal touch that he puts on him, and then he heals him. Jesus is doing something that no one else could do. No one else has the power and authority to do it. You see, the people who are following him are now amazed because of how he taught. Now they're going to be amazed by his kindness and his compassion. They're going to be amazed by his power. Not only did no one ever speak like he does, no one ever acted like he does. And so what do we learn out of this? We can learn that we can be kind and compassionate and caring. Just like Jesus was. We can't do the healing. And I think we get that. We're not able to do what he did in that regard. But it's perfectly within our capability to be kind and compassionate. It does not take any miraculous power to be kind and compassionate. And Jesus did that. Any questions or comments?
The leper took Emmanuel's words. I assume start the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew
Yeah.
I mean, he heard it, he believed it, acted on it.
You know, we don't know whether he heard it or not. Maybe he heard it at a distance because, you know, I doubt he was in the crowd because that wouldn't have flown very well. And of course, he's coming right down off the mountain. So unless he was hearing it from a distance, he maybe hadn't. But certainly he believed it. He believed in Jesus. And he comes to him in faith and says, if you will, you can make me clean. You know, he knew that Jesus could do it. Why do you suppose he had so much faith when others didn't?
He had so little to lose.
He had so little to lose. And that dynamic is still true today. Those that have very little to lose find they have greater faith.
And we have to remember, too, that when these faith healers and things that are said, they don't heal someone who's way down here. You know, because that's not going to get any kind of reaction. They got to do something that people are going to notice. And Jesus took a step back to heal this guy. He didn't take a prominent person who had leprosy. He took someone that no one cared about, someone that everyone else overlooked. He was tearing the walls down.
Yeah, definitely. And like we've noticed, Jesus heals regardless of whether people have faith or not. And the apostles do the same thing. And, you know, if there's ever a reason why people weren't able to heal, Jesus' disciples in Matthew 17 aren't able to heal. But the problem was not with the person, it was with them. It was their lack of faith. And in Scripture, anyone who is unable to heal somebody, that's the reason why. It's the lack of faith on the part of the one doing the healing. It's the same reason why the sons of Sceva aren't able to cast out demons in the book of Acts. It's because of their lack of faith and their lack of connection with God, and not anything to do with the healer. If the healer has the faith, doesn't matter necessarily what the other individual has. So,
Also gave him something to do, too, after.
yes.
Go back to the priest and offer the gift.
Yes. And you know, yeah, that's where I wanted to conclude with this. Is yeah, he has to do what's required of the law, and that was to go to the priest, show them that you are free of the leprosy in order to do that. And he had to do that and offer the gift that was required of that. You know, Jesus, you know, healed these individuals, but the kind of healings that he's doing are not the kind of healings that faith healers today do. You know, he's going to heal this leper, a verifiable illness. He's going to heal the paralyzed. He's going to heal the demon-possessed. He's going to heal the blind and the lame. You know, these kind of things don't get healed today. It's always headaches, unseen tumors, and things like that. And, you know, not things that are verifiable. And that's certainly different from what Christ did. Also, something that's different, a lot of people will recognize somebody that's in very bad shape, and they'll maybe go through an accident. The fact that they survive and all, people say it's a miracle. Well, if it's a miracle, you don't have to do rehab. You're completely better immediately. You don't have to learn how to walk again. You don't have to have rehab. You don't have to have corrective surgery. You don't have to have drugs to help. You're better. And, you know, the healing was complete. And sometimes that's the most amazing thing. Some of these individuals that are healed, to me what's most amazing is some of these ones that have been paralyzed from birth and whatever, they've never walked before. And all of a sudden they can. You know, if you go any significant time and not walk, even if you know how, you have to learn how to do it again. Your muscles have to be strengthened and conditioned to do it again. But if you've never walked, You don't have the muscular structure to do it. Even if medicine was able to fix it so that your bones and your nerves and your body could work, even if they could correctively, surgically do it, you don't have the musculature to walk without many years of intense therapy to get you there if you've never walked. So to me, the bigger miracle is not that he healed them, it's the fact that they were immediately able to walk without having had the strength and the musculature to do that. Because even if you can correct the injury, you can't provide the muscle immediately. It just cannot happen. It's gone immediately. It takes time. It takes. I'm not a doctor, but I'm not going to be treating you for leprosy. I think it takes intense antibiotics. I think it's a virus of sorts that leprosy is. I think it takes a lot of antibiotics. It maybe takes corrective surgery, but it takes time. It takes time to be healed, even in the modern era of leprosy. But yet, it's immediate. And anyway. All right, hit it, Jim. Matthew 13 next week. If you want to read ahead, study Matthew 13. Damage and dangerous. Good deal.
Go ahead, here, take this for me, because I gotta go back there and rinse this off.